Welcome, everyone, to Alaska Quarterly Review's Reading and Conversation series. This event is being recorded and will be available on the Alaska Quarterly Review YouTube channel. Please feel free to watch any of our prior programs and to share them. Alaska Quarterly Review is committed to presenting these programs without charge and to showcase vibrant and diverse and emerging voices and literary conversations with depth, complexity, and humanity. I am Ronald Spatz, Editor-in-Chief of Alaska Quarterly Review, and before we begin, I'd like to make a few important acknowledgments. Alaska Quarterly Review gratefully acknowledges the Anchorage Museum for hosting and providing technical support for this event, and the Center for the Narrative and Lyric Arts, Alaska Quarterly Review's 501c3 umbrella organization, which makes this event possible. I also want to make a land acknowledgement. Alaska Quarterly Review recognizes the indigenous land on which all Alaskans live, and Alaska Quarterly Review is located in Anchorage, and Anchorage is Dena'ina homeland. Dena'ina is the language spoken by the traditional, present, and future caretakers of this land, and land acknowledgement opens a space with gratefulness and respect for the contributions, innovations, and contemporary perspective of indigenous peoples and marks our collective movement toward decolonization and equity. Today, we're delighted to be featuring a poetry reading by poet W.J. Herbert. W.J. Herbert is the author of the poetry collection Dear Specimen, Beacon Press 2021. It was selected by Kwame Dawes as the winner of the 2020 National Poetry Series and was awarded the 2022 Maine Literary Award for Poetry. The collection was featured in the New Yorker Climate Crisis newsletter and also included in Poetry for the Extinction Crisis on NPR's Living on Earth with host Steve Curwood. W.J. Herbert was also a winner of the 22 Arts and Letters Rumi Prize for Poetry, and Herbert's work has appeared in many literary venues, including Alaska Quarterly, the Atlantic, the Georgia Review, the Hudson Review, Southern Review, and in 2 volumes of the Best American Poetry. Library Journal said this of Dear Specimen: Herbert writes movingly about a world of extinction, using the lenses of fossils and storytelling to create an involving worldview. The writer's gift for deep seeing elevates even the smallest details. In mostly short poems, Herbert describes a vibrant yet highly vulnerable world. She breathes life into the fossil skeletons and nature today, even our world in its current damaged state. A unique and thrilling collection that pulses with wonder not to be missed. And poet Robert Wrigley, who's appeared in our pages and on this series, added, "There's no way to say this after reading Dear Specimen. I was stricken. I felt like my heart was breaking because it was. But I also know this: if there is any consolation to be found in the acknowledgement of humanity's crimes against the planet, such consolation will come to us through art like that of W.J. Herbert. Yes, the book will break your heart because it is beautiful, eloquently, and artfully enacts our common responsibility in the loss of the thing we all share and depend upon, the single thing no one can leave without, our mother, Earth." It is my pleasure to welcome W.J. Herbert.
Thank you so much, Ron, for that lovely introduction and for inviting me to read today. I have a soft spot in my heart for Alaska Quarterly Review and for your 40 years of dedication so thank you so much. And thank you, Danny, for facilitating this reading. I'd like to start with a poem that will be coming up in the Alaska Quarterly Review in the coming months. It's called When Knowing is the Same as Late Winter Waiting. Why is the body still working if it knows what's to come? Isn't it cowed? Sometimes I think the blood thinks, the way these robins must wonder whether the liquid amber will leaf again as they sit with their light bulb breasts glowing, orange suns among skeleton branches, clots in the deep veined tree. They flutter as I imagine my heart does, just to see if it can feel itself alive in the quiet darkness of stiff ribs. Regreening, that's what the robins want, but they can't know what's coming. They wait as we do, death's tucked into a pocket of sky. Well, as Ron mentioned, my first collection was Dear Specimen, and it focused on a speaker's whose impending death was difficult, and she was looking for answers for how to put her life in context. And she looked at specimens in a museum, and she looked at the animals around her, and she tried to understand what her death would mean also to her daughter, the daughter she would leave behind, and to the planet, the dying planet that she was, what our future might be with the climate crisis. And as soon as I finished that book, I began writing a second collection, which a manuscript I've just finished. And it too has a grieving speaker, but this speaker is grieving for her own mother's death. And she's trying to come to terms with it. And she and her mother, when she was a child, her mother brought her to the desert, the western edge of the Sonoran Desert, where they discovered the flora and fauna of that rich desert ecology. They had come from the Midwest, and her mother especially loved the desert bighorn sheep. They're called peninsular desert bighorn. And these sheep have been endangered since 1970. And the Desert Bighorn Institute has done a captive and breeding and release program. So the herd is very, very small. In 2000, it was the San Jacinto herd was only 4 ewes, which is a functionally extinct herd. So this poem takes place at the moment of her mother's death, but she's thinking back on the childhood and their mutual love of the sheep. In the poem, I mentioned creosote, not the mixture of noxious chemicals we use to protect wood with, but the native plant that grows on the rocky hillsides in the desert. And I also mentioned ocotillo, which most of the year you see only as spiny skeletal branches attached to the sand. But when it rains, little green leaves bloom. And in the spring, there are fuchsia blossoms, which hummingbirds love. Precipice. The endangered peninsular bighorn inhabits canyons, washes, and cliffs. That's the epigraph. Precipice. After the herd slipped into the hills above the gashed plateau that builders carved from a cliffside scrap of habitat, seekers who came to breathe sage, creosote bursting open after rain, would peer from terraces, searching the dry hillside for camouflaged rams. Bellies bulging, ewes could barely cobble a path to water deep in the canyon, newly cut by a winding road that trucks hurtled up, churning dust, scarring blind curves with a halo of danger. After a lamb was struck, the herd tried to move on, but there was nowhere for them to go. We didn't see them die, but saw the signs. She went that way too. I watched a hummingbird lap nectar with a silken thread, its frantic fans cooling an ocotillo branch. I ate lunch. Her eyes were closed when I told her that I'd nap there at the foot of her bed. I was asleep when she stopped breathing. So the manuscript circles back again and again to the moment of her mother's death, but each time the reader returns, you know more about what their life together was like, how they experienced the desert together, and their love of the desert. And this poem, you can see that the poem itself disappears on the page. And it sort of mirrors the kind of loss that we feel when a loved one dies. In the vacuum left by her last breath, I tried to hold on to her bedpost, but had no hands, and so spiraled up fraying, as if I were a fantasy depiction of the cosmos, stars constellating from a core so cold, you know it's not real. Below, she lay motionless, arms freckled, plump as if still soft. Her nightgown the green of honey mesquite, whose seeds sparrows love. If I hadn't become the Milky Way, I would have touched her. You can see in the background, I'm doing this reading from a very beautiful space. It's the University of Arizona Poetry Center, a center that was started in 1960 and which now has 60,000 volumes and documents, including a rare book room, broadsides, chapbooks. It's a truly remarkable place. And I'm at the anteroom to the rare book room. Back behind me is a sculpture by a Hopi woman called Look to the Mesa. And so I come as often as I can, once a year, to read everything that I can get my hands on, and to really enjoy poetry in this beautiful, well-lit space. And speaking of light, I wanted to tell you a little bit more about this manuscript, which I'm not giving you the name to just in case the title morphs, but at the moment, it goes in and out, as I said, of the moment of the mother's death. But because the daughter has, at one point in her life, told her mother that she wouldn't go with her to see the sacred spaces of Saint-Chapelle in Paris and the Chartres Cathedral, she feels some guilt. This was at a time when her own mother's mother had died, and the mother seemed so inconsolable that the speaker of this manuscript, Sarah, decides not to go with her. It's going to be too much grief for her to hold. But when her mother dies, she finds herself in looking at the stained glass windows, trying to understand what this loss could mean and how somehow in the sacred light through the windows, she might find some relief from her grief. This visit that she makes to the cathedral and the chapel is interspersed in the poems that are the memoir of the desert. So what I'm going to read to you is a small segment from this larger canvas of the stained glass windows, the Baroque stained glass windows. And in this particular section of it, it's told from the first person of Sarah. She's narrating it. And all you need to know is that in Chartres, there is a Baroque sculpture, massive, 250 tons, called the Assumption of the Virgin, and it dominates the high altar at Chartres. A priest casts over his head, then mine, mist from a holy implement, but the organ's chords clash, their dissonance a dispute over the existence of eternity, light in a dome of sky, the choir singing to a dozen elders wearing overcoats because the cathedral is so cold, the little bells announcing what? A man in a trench coat speaking French into a microphone, his syllables so elongated that echoes obscure his words. Then the call and response are, no, it's just another hymn. While a boy, nesting in his mother's arms, head buried in her sweater, begins to wiggle. Has anyone told him who the whale-sized figure carved in marble is meant to be? Shipwrecked stone, its waves rolling beneath a floating body whose arms beckon, the woman trying to rise from her tomb's cloud ship, angels shouldering the ethereal white and billowing stone of her body, as if lifting easily the impossible rock, its marble lit with incandescence, as welling up in waves, the voice of the choir laps against it, their hymn its own cloak, and I can feel my cheeks heat, the air of the cathedral taking on a green tint, lichens tinge seeping into the priest's cassock, his assistant's robes no longer white but jade-like, the lectern mossy, even the smoke swirling out of the censer is emerald, but the glass of the Gothic windows glow with the same disturbing red as yesterday when the light was stingier, and I wonder why these greens have descended like a second eyelid, as if I were a serpent coiled in a choir stall, biding its time. The priest intoning ad infinitum his vowels, a river of ragged stones thrown from the microphone as if he could drive the doubt out of me. But I know what it means to be cold. My mother's skin is unflinching as marble, no more likely to rise than bubbles trapped in glass. So I won't tell you how the collection ends, but I will say that it ends in the desert on a more hopeful note. And I want to come back to a poem that appeared in Alaska Quarterly Review and which I have in Dear Specimen. And it was the trigger for this second collection. It also happened at the moment of my mother's death. That's when it takes place. And all you need to know is that I was there at the moment of my mother's death, and she had above her bed a lithograph that was done by Georgia O'Keeffe. And it was part of a series called Save Our Planet. And this particular contribution by Georgia O'Keeffe was called Save Our Planet, Save Our Air. But others in the series, which came out in the 70s, 1970s, one was Buckminster Fuller's geodesic dome over a city, and the poster was titled Save Our Planet, Save Our Cities. Another was done by Roy Lichtenstein, and it was Save Our Planet, Save Our Water, and it was a beautiful seascape with his characteristic comic book dots at the top. So my mother herself was very involved in ecology and preservation efforts. And so I thought you should know that before I read this poem, which appeared in the Alaska Quarterly Review. It's called A Pastoral Topography. Above her bed, she hung a lithograph of clouds, or was it icebergs? Snow geese floating off a coast, cotton in a sea island field. She'd imagined lambs in the Eden above us, blessing what was left of her life, and I wanted to touch each one. But she wanted to touch each one, but I'd said, stop pretending. In the end, she pointed, keep this picture, so I hung it on my stairway wall. If I lift my head, ovals float in a heaven of ice or air that lightens as I climb, as if breezes rising to the airborne plane of another place are lifting me with them, and soon I'll become as light as she did that day, between the time I closed my eyes to escape her labored breathing and the moment after. And I'd like to close with a final poem. Thank you again, Ron, for this wonderful invitation to read today, and to Danny for facilitating. And we're all very grateful for your literary efforts for 40 years, Ron, to produce such a wonderful journal. And I'm very grateful to be part of it. This last poem is one in which the speaker who is dying is enchanted by the red wolf. And the epigraph for the poem reads, "Once extinct in the wild, reintroduced red wolves look like a distinct species, but their genetics show mixing with other canids." And that was written by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And the poem is called Hybrid. And thank you for listening. Hybrid. If you're a red wolf, you know what I'm talking about. You're almost gone. Why wouldn't you mate with gray wolves, coyotes, dogs? I'd do it. Give up the coral edges of my ears, my reddish brows, even the tawny fur that blossoms down my snout and slips into my whiskers. But red, don't change your nose. Heady well that every scent falls into. Rotting cypress, lynx pea wet in leaf fall. The tree frog's throat rattling like little nails riveting into your skin. Milk snake shushing pine needles as you pass. Thank you.